Hi, good afternoon everyone. Welcome back to the virtual classes. In today's class, we will discuss evolution of Indian banking system. That means history of Indian banking. Already in a previous session, I gave you some YouTube links to understand the basics, but in today's session, we will understand in depth exactly how it evolved. So, when we discuss about evolution of banking institutions in India, mainly we can classify this journey into three phases. Early phase, that is 1770 to 1969, and a middle phase 1969 to 1991, and a new phase 1991 to till now, till date. So these are the three main phases we can classify this journey just for a simple understanding. It makes us to understand very easily when we discuss this in a different phases. And in this years, the major changes. That is why we have taken this particular year, 1770 to 1969. So after 69, there were major changes, and after 1991, again there were major changes in the banking system. That is why we had converted this into different phases. So quickly, we will move to the next phase. The first one, early phase, 1770 to 1969. In this phase, I will start from the beginning. In 1770, the first bank in India is Bank of Hindustan. It set off in the year 1770, and this was the first bank. Later, they closed this bank in 80s. Then next, East India Company established the Bank of Bengal, Bank of Bombay, and Bank of Madras. Actually, these three banks are independent units when they established, and they called it presidency banks. So in your syllabus, there is a presidency bank, imperial bank, different kinds of banks. Presidency bank means what? Presidency banks is a group of these three banks: Bank of Bengal, Bank of Bombay, Bank of Madras. Okay, combined together they called presidency banks, and it is established by East India Company. It was established by East India Company, and later they merged these three banks and they called it Imperial Bank of India. So please understand this. When they started these three banks, okay, they called it presidency banks, and later they merged these three banks and they called it Imperial Bank of India. In 1920 they formed Imperial Bank of India. This Imperial Bank of India is at present what we call State Bank of India. That means in India, the oldest existing bank is SBI, State Bank of India. Oldest bank is Bank of Hindustan because it started first in India, but they closed that bank. The still existing oldest is State Bank of India. So earlier the name of State Bank of India was Imperial Bank of India. And again in 1865, Allahabad Bank was established exclusively by Indians. See, this Imperial Bank was established by East India Company. But in 1865, Allahabad Bank was established exclusively by Indians. Indians established this. Then Punjab National Bank was established in 1894. By this slide, you can understand one thing. You all know that RBI it came to exist in 1935, but these banks are even older than the RBI. RBI is the central bank, so regulatory authority for all the commercial banks in India. But this Punjab National Bank, Allahabad Bank, Imperial Bank, these banks are the oldest banks, even RBI. Next, in the same phase, between 1906 to 1913, there were so many banks came into exist. Bank of India, Bank of Baroda, Canara Bank, Indian Bank, and Bank of Mysore were set up in this period. Okay, 1906 to 1913. That means these banks also older than the Reserve Bank of India. In 1935, we established Reserve Bank of India as per the Reserve Bank Act. It is in 1935. So next, Banking Regulation Act 1949. So government, they thought for some changes. There was a huge failure in the banking system during the first phase. Hence, to make banking functions and activities organized, the government of India came up with Banking Regulation Act 1949. Earlier, when they started this, they called Banking Companies Act 1949, but later they changed it into Banking Regulation Act 1949. Now we will move to the middle phase, the second phase, that is 1969 to 1991. Here, in 1955, government nationalized the Imperial Bank of India. That means the first bank to get nationalized in India is Imperial Bank of India. So here you need to understand what is nationalization. You may get doubt. So what is nationalization? Nationalization means it is a simple process whereby a national government or a state government take over the private industry or a private organization or private asset into public ownership by an act of ordinance or by some other kind of orders. So government taking over the private banks or private institutions or private organizations, for that we call nationalization. So in simple words, nationalization means converting the private companies into the government companies. So government will take the ownership. So that is nationalization. So here first bank to get nationalized in India is Imperial Bank of India. You may be heard about the nationalization of banks. Most of us know about 1969, 14 banks nationalized. Then later in 1980, 6 banks nationalized. We all know that story. But before that, even before that, in 1955 itself, government nationalized Imperial Bank of India. The Imperial Bank of India is at present State Bank of India. Next, government formed the State Bank of India as a principal agent of RBI in 1955. That means the Imperial Bank of India, what we had earlier, we just changed the name into State Bank of India in 1955. So we formed State Bank of India in 1955, and again later we formed some 7 subsidiary banks for the SBI, and we nationalized that banks also. So now there are no subsidiaries for the SBI. So recently some 5 subsidiaries merged with the SBI. So now we have only State Bank of India. So earlier we have this State Bank of Bikaner and Jaipur, State Bank of Hyderabad, State Bank of Indore, State Bank of Mysore, State Bank of Patiala, Saurashtra, Travancore. We used to have these banks, but now we have only SBI due to the merger of these banks. Now, in 1969, 14 major commercial banks were nationalized. So when we come to the types of banks, I will explain you what is public sector bank, what is commercial banks, foreign banks, private banks, everything I will explain there. So for instance, you just understand 14 major commercial banks were nationalized in 1969. The name of those 14 banks, it is mentioned here for your reference. Allahabad Bank, Bank of Baroda, Bank of India, Bank of Maharashtra, Canara Bank, Central Bank of India, Dina Bank, Indian Bank, Punjab and Sindh Bank, Syndicate Bank, Indian Overseas Bank, UCO Bank, Punjab National Bank, and United Bank of India. These are the 14 banks nationalized. Okay, this is the major nationalization in 1969 during the Indira Gandhi term. After again, later in 1980, six more banks nationalized in a second phase. This is again second very important step in the banking sector. In 1980s, Government of India nationalized six more banks, okay, with the deposit of some 200 crores and above. That is Andhra Bank Limited, Punjab and Sindh Bank Limited, Corporation Bank Limited, Oriental Bank of Commerce Limited, Vijaya Bank Limited, New Bank of India Limited. So quickly after this nationalization, New Bank of India, it is merged with Punjab National Bank. We'll move to here in this slide. You can get the overview of this middle phase. That means from 1969 to 1991, whatever the actions taken by government, the steps taken by the government of India to regulate the banking system in India. So here yearly wise I had given, it is just a brief, just what we call bulletins to understand quickly. 1949 approving Banking Regulation Act, and in 1955 nationalization of SBI, and 1959 nationalization of SBI subsidiaries, that means 7 banks. 1969 nationalization of 14 major banks, and in 1971 creation of Credit Guarantee Corporation. 1975 establishment of regional rural banks. So it is one type of bank. I will explain you when we reach that. 1980 nationalization of 6 banks. Again, this is the second phase of major nationalization. You may get a doubt, so why they do this nationalization of banks? What is the purpose? Why they convert private banks into the government banks? It's very simple. The nationalization of commercial banks takes place with a main objective to achieve a social welfare and controlling the monopolies and expansion of banking and developing the banking habits. Because when we give complete power to the private people, they may act as a monopoly. They may be having only bank in that particular area, so they act as a monopoly. They fix their own interest rates. Okay, so they act like a monopoly, and to control that monopoly, and for the social welfare, for the betterment of the society, and also for the expansion of banking, so government nationalized the banks. Coming to the third phase, that is new phase, 1991 to till date. So here the major change is M. Narasimhan Committee. Government framed a committee called M. Narasimhan Committee in order to improve the financial stability and profitability of the public sector banks. The government of India set up this committee under the chairmanship of Sri M. Narasimhan. So they gave some recommendations. Out of that, I picked up some 4 main recommendations given by that committee. First one is, they said, make banks more competitive and strong for the stability of the financial system. Second one, they said, suggest for no more nationalization banks. So that committee suggested, don't go for any more nationalization of banks. Third point, public sector banks and the private banks should be treated equally by the government and RBI both, because RBI is a regulating body, and the government that also helps the policy creating body. So that is why they said you must treat both private bank, government bank equally. Then only that gives growth for the banking sector in India. Then last point, permit foreign banks to set up branches or subsidiaries. They also suggested permit the foreign banks to come and start their branches in India. Just set up their branches or subsidiaries in India. Then what is the effect of these recommendations? They gave the recommendations. Government accepted majority of their most of the recommendations they accepted government. Then what is the effect? The effect is more foreign banks came to India and merged with the Indian banks they started and set up new branches in India. That means entry of foreign banks to India it is started. They started with joint ventures, mergers and separate branches. Then another effect is 10 private players got a license from the RBI. That means to start up banks, private people again, some 10 more private persons got a license from RBI to start up banks because in this they suggested treat equally the private banks and government banks treat equally. So that is why RBI issued a license for some 10 more banks in this. In this slide, I gave a chart and this chart is directly taken from Wikipedia. This chart is very helpful to understand the merger of banks with a different bank and established dates and the headquarters. Now, there are hyperlinks given here. If you want more details, you can click on that hyperlink. I will share this PPT in your class group. See, recently Vijaya Bank and Dina Bank merged with Bank of Baroda and Bank of India, Bank of Maharashtra, still individual banks. Syndicate Bank merged with Canara Bank. Central Bank, it is still individual. Allahabad Bank again merged with Indian Bank. And Indian Overseas Bank, Punjab and Sindh Bank still working as individual units. Oriental Bank of Commerce, United Bank of India. These two merged with Punjab National Bank. So earlier I told you New Bank of India also merged with Punjab National Bank. So these all are, it is very helpful to understand the merger of different banks. You can also look at the headquarters, so you can read on your own. Then State Bank of India, you all know all the 7 subsidiary banks merged with State Bank of India. Now we have only one bank and the State Bank of India. Okay. UCO Bank, it is still individual, and recently Andhra Bank and the Corporation Bank, it is merged with Union Bank of India. So this chart is helpful to understand the recent merger in the banking sector, and also if you want the date of establishment you can easily understand, and the headquarters of the different banks you can easily understand. I hope all of you understood the basics, the evolution. So from the first Bank of India, Bank of Hindustan, so how we reached this level? Now we are treating both public and private banks equally. So how we reached this level and from different phases. I hope everyone understood. If you have any doubts, you can text me. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.